Good day. My reflection today is out of the Gospel reading from this morning, Mark 16. And if I could focus on a couple of verses out of that chapter, verses 11, verse 13, and verse 14. And it reads in verse 11, "But when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it." Verse 13, "And when they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them." And verse 14, "Later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen." We all know the story of the resurrection Sunday by heart, how Jesus rose from the dead and he was crucified for our sins and defeated death, hell, and the grave for us. We all know the suffering that took place on that Good Friday. We all know the events of Maundy Thursday, where he washed his disciples' feet and he broke bread and instituted a new covenant with them. And then he was later on betrayed by one of his own disciples. We know the story forward and backwards, but if I can focus on what takes place after he has risen from the dead. Early that morning, as Mary Magdalene had intentions to anoint Jesus' body with spices as a final preparation of burial, he appeared to her first, and in Mark's account of this story, the disciples do not believe her when she says to them, "He is risen." Mark goes on to state that Jesus appeared to two more of them walking into the country, and those two did not believe either. Mark finally concludes that Jesus appears to the 11 and he upbraids them for their lack of faith and stubbornness because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. We as human beings all can relate with the story of Thomas as being the only disciple who ever doubted or who ever lacked faith. But Mark, on more than one account, gives fault to all of the disciples for lacking faith. The disciples' experience was just as much real as Thomas's own. Jesus appeared to them because at that point they still did not believe that he had risen, even though the stone had been rolled away, even though they received different accounts from different people that Jesus was risen from the dead, even though Jesus himself told them that the Son of Man would be betrayed and crucified and 3 days later would rise. They acknowledged Jesus to be the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. But the mystery about the grave is still a mystery. They saw the stone being rolled to close the tomb, and they believed that that was the end to the Paschal mystery. They thought that that was the end of the resurrection story. The men and women who walked with Jesus during his ministry on earth thought that when the stone was rolled to close the tomb, that there would be nothing left to tell of the story of Jesus Christ. They walked with him, and they saw him help the blind to see. They saw him help the deaf to hear. They saw him feed 5,000 people off of 2 small fish and 5 small barley loaves. They themselves had a first-hand account of such things. They had a seat at the feet of Jesus. And still in that moment, when the stone closed the tomb, I can only imagine that their faith in that time was shattered. But Jesus expected much more out of these persons whom he traveled with for years. He expected that their faith would not be shattered as such. He expected them to believe that he still had the power to overcome his situation. He at least expected them to believe one another, to those whom he appeared to. But still he had to appear to the many. That is why he chastised them when he had to appear to the many, because in those moments when their faith was to be tested, their faith came up as lacking. We must realize as a Christian community, we didn't have the same face-to-face experience with the Christ, but as we journey day to day, we have the accounts of all the saints. We live with him in our hearts. We intentionally recount all that he went through to save us. He died for us on the cross so that he might live in us through our own life. Romans 5 verse 8 reminds us, but God proves his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He knew us and still wanted a relationship with us. He knew our faults and our strength, and on the cross where he died, he knew our names, and still opted to die for us. In all of their moments, in their lack of faith that Mark accounts, we must be reminded that God still has the whole world in his hand. We must be reminded that nothing has taken him by surprise. We must be reminded that God is still on the throne. When we look at the world and all that has taken place because of the COVID-19 coronavirus, we must stay grounded in the faith of Christ crucified. Do not lose heart, for the same God that raised Christ from the dead is the same God that is protecting us during this time. I encourage all of you to stay inside and stay safe, but to also stay prayed up. The hymn writer says, when I kneel in prayer, and with thee, my God, I commune as friend with friend. Amen.